here to hear the first in this season's Rendez-vous de l'Institut talks that will be given by Lynnette Widder, who will be introduced by Ralph Ghosh, and I will introduce them in a moment. But I want to first of all ask everybody if they would be kind enough to make sure that you have muted yourself and I think turned off your video as well, so that we can hear the speakers clearly. Thank you very much. And let me just say a few words by way of introduction, because it's very moving for me personally to see you all and to be here at the start of a new year. It's now getting on for 12 months since we had our last live Rendez-vous de l'Institut. Ralph was part of that group, and we, like everybody else, were plunged into uncertainty. And I think if anybody had said that we would be fortunate enough to be able to welcome a new class of fellows in the middle of the pandemic to Paris, we would have reacted in disbelief. But we have done, and I want to pay tribute to Marie and James and Eve of the staff of the Institute for everything they've done to make that possible, and to formally, I suppose, welcome the 9 fellows who are in residence at the Institute now, for their confidence and participation and trust. We have a wonderful program of events lined up at the Rendezvous this spring, and I hope you will join us for those future events. The next will be the composer Sky McClay talking in March, and Karima Ashadu, the filmmaker, talking in April. Well, I would like to welcome Lynnette, who is an associate professor of practice at Columbia University, and who will be talking to us about her work. And to introduce her, Ralph Ghosh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at Barnard, and who we tried to trap last year in Paris because he was a fellow with us when COVID struck, but he managed to escape eventually and make his way back to New York. But Ralph, it was a great pleasure to get to know you last year and to hear about your own work. Ralph was and is working on the role of the Catholic Church in 19th century Algeria in transforming the urban environment of Algeria in the interest of the Christianization of North Africa. He has agreed to introduce Lynnette, and so I will hand over at this point to Ralph and just simply say to those of you who've joined us to listen, if you have questions at any point, you can submit them in writing on the chat function, or you can raise your hands at the end, and that we hope you will all continue to follow the Institute on its social media, in which we advertise our events in future. So thank you very much for joining us. Ralph, I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. And it's really an honor to be invited here today to contribute to this event of a friend of mine, Lynnette. And I have to say, I was really so happy, so elated to get word sometime last spring that this year's crop of fellows would include again an architectural historian. We are such rare birds on university campus that so it's really deeply heartening to know that we continue to be well represented at the Institute. Lynnette Widder is an associate professor of practice in the Masters of Sustainability Management master's program at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. She is the principal investigator on a 2-year project funded by the UN Development Program in Guinea and the Earth Institute to support community-based environmental impact assessment from bauxite mining. Her other work and research projects include urban resource flows, community resilience. She's also a practicing architect with the firm Ardv Architecture, and she's completed with this firm a number of projects, mostly in and around New York, including what I thought was a very ambitious prototype for a solar penthouse addition that I presume it can be adapted for different rooftop configurations, and actually is a net energy producer. And of course, this question of the environment is one of those many connections that brought us, Lynnette and I, together. a few years back. She's also an architectural historian and holds a PhD from the ETH in Zurich. Her current work, which you'll be hearing about today, is focused on architecture, construction, and urbanism in post-war Germany. Prior to joining the Earth Institute, she was associate professor and head of the Department of Architecture at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. She is the author of a couple books, From Year Zero to Economic Miracle, West German Architecture, 1849 to I'm forever in the 19th century, 1949 and 1963, and Live Projects, Pedagogy into Practice, published in 2014, as well as Ira Rakotansky, As Modern as Tomorrow, published by William Stout in 2010. In addition, she's curated several exhibitions on architecture and urbanism, and she's published widely on all of the topics she's engaged with, on the environment, on post-war Germany, and on her own practice has been published in numerous publications. So it's a real joy and privilege to welcome Lynnette.
Thank you so much, Ralph. I'm glad I don't have to expand my credentials to include 19th century Germany at this point, because that would be tough in the time given to me. Anyway, I will share screen and start my presentation. I am so thrilled to see so many familiar names and some not familiar names, but in a way, this feels almost like a giant birthday party with everyone important to me showing up. So thank you all for being here. All right, let me share screen. So in addition to thanking people who are on this call, as well as those who aren't, for advising and supporting my work over several years, I want to also start by thanking specifically my friend, the wonderful photographer Thad Russell, whose photographs I rely on heavily for this presentation and that you'll be seeing. Clearly, I also want to thank Mark and Marie and James and Eve and the Institute for Ideas and Imagination for this occasion. I would say, although I've only been in Paris for 5 weeks, there has already been a clear resonance with the work going on here and with my colleagues. I'm just going to mention one particular example because it's particularly relevant here. While I was preparing my talk, one of the current fellows, Anouk Arad-Pragasam, said something that really resonated. I'm going to give you his disclaimer, which is that this idea is not original to him, but be that as it may. He pointed out to me that commitment to any project over the course of years will inevitably change its author. Ask of a project, he said, although I'm paraphrasing here, what kind of person it might make of you. If I were to answer his question retrospectively, I would say that the research I've carried out, albeit intermittently over the past 2 decades, has made me more attentive to the moments at which individual desires converge with the complex, largely anonymous systems that produce architecture. Real insight into these convergences is dependent on access to the documents that record them. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about those documents and how they can expand upon what otherwise might initially seem a relatively causal and linear account of the changes that occurred in the style preferred by the mainstream of West German architecture in the 1950s. There were 2 primary concerns for architects at the moment that marked the founding of the German Federal Republic. The first was practical: how to address the devastation that war had left behind, particularly the drastic shortage of housing, exacerbated by migrations not equaled in magnitude. We're talking about 40 million displaced people until the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011. The second concern was no less important, if much more abstract. How was a new democratic Germany to represent itself? Recourse to history, Even modernist architectural history was at best complicated by the fact that the Third Reich had happily used modernist architecture to advance its agenda of technical prowess and progress. This was also further complicated by the simple reality that with the emigration of such Bauhaus prominences as Walter Gropius, the legacy of the Bauhaus was no longer exclusively German. And of course, Weimar and Dessau, homes of the Bauhaus, were now both in the German Democratic Republic on the wrong side of the border. If their response took one form in 1949, when my account begins, its form was quite different by 1958, when West Germany mounted its first presence at the World's Fair since Speer's 1937 face-off with the Soviet pavilion in Paris. I'll be describing these changes relative to two specific architects. Among the reasons for which I selected them, one was certainly that they allowed me to trace these changes by writing an architectural history that hinges on what I'm calling today ephemera. This is the crux of my argument, that these changes are intimately related to the material culture of the moment. These two figures were Sep Ruf, who you see here, a prolific Bavarian architect known in his later career for large corporate and public sector clients, and Hans Schwippert, who you saw in the prior image, heady and articulate, savvy about the relationship between industry and designer, but as an architect, devoted to the one-off. Again, this is an image of Ruf with a very debonair Egon Eiermann smoking in the background. The fact that I found this photo in Schwippert's papers, to me, is a testimony to their friendship and commonalities, despite their divergent architectural preferences over the course of the 50s. But if the answers to my research questions reside in ephemera, so too do its origins. In 1996, I was working as the English language editor of the Berlin Art and Architecture Quarterly, Daedalus. We had just adjourned a meeting about an issue that my colleague Josef Imorda and I were co-editing. The journal's founder, Ulrich Konrad, stopped me at the conference room door. Alles, was man über Raum sagen müsste, he said, everything to be said about space, was said in 1951 in Darmstadt. I wish now that I had asked him why he chose to address this assertion to me. Use, as we called him, using his decades-old journalist byline, meant the 1951 Darmstädter Gespräch, the second in a series of conferences intended to rebuild cultural life after the year zero of the Third Reich. Its topic was the human being in space, Mensch und Raum. Its ambitions were to address the challenges of practicing architects, challenges both of expedience and of transcendental meaning. Typeset in the wide margins of the published transcription are indications that record when the audience responded by applauding, stamping their feet, laughing, or sometimes catcalling. It must have been very lively. There were prepared lectures, among them Heidegger's first public reading of Building Dwelling Thinking. I imagine it was more than challenging to listen to his monotone in the packed auditorium on a hot, airless summer's day. But even more powerful, at least to my mind, were the unscripted discussions led by Schwippert. Some 30 of the most prolific workaday architects, including Ruf, were able to sustain a serious, intellectually rigorous effort to rethink the hermeneutics of modern architecture around the concept Schwippert proposed, wohnen wollen, or the will to dwell or inhabit. Accompanying the two-day event was a summer-length exhibition, which included a host of new design projects for the decimated city of Darmstadt. And I've selected the pages that show Schwippert's school, which you saw as a model in the first slide as he was describing it to Bundespräsident Theodor Heuss. The implications of this decision to show these new design projects was clear. This was a call to action. Quote, building corresponds to the essence of our time, as the exhibition preamble read. The exigency of our time is homelessness. The contemporary architecture shown in the exhibition was filigree, white painted, thinly dimensioned, transparent, and ethereal. This, it seems, was the space of Wohnwollen, despite, as the discussants noted, the threatening atmosphere of the emergent Cold War and nuclear age. It prevailed despite the challenges to its construction amidst a dearth of such necessary materials as steel, glass, and concrete. Here you see Sep Ruf's Akademie der Künste in Nuremberg, the Academy of Art, a project under construction in 1951 and largely completed around 1955. It exemplifies the architecture advocated at Darmstadt. The overhanging roof eaves are thin and elegant. The steel columns and window frames are minimally dimensioned. The trees of the surrounding woodlands seem to have found their way onto the grounds, an art school in the midst of a natural landscape. And the buildings are all white painted, a study in abstract planes and volumes. This is Ruf's Hochschule für Verwaltungswissenschaften, the College of Public Administration, a project that his office began in 1957, a little over a year after completing the Akademie der Künste. It's part of a new campus, for the first and for a long time, only college at which West German civil servants could train. Located in Speyer, in what was the French-occupied sector, it followed a French precedent, educating civil servants in administration per se, rather than, as in the old pre-war German model, drafting them from the cadre of those trained in law. These projects are stunningly different to my eyes, despite their chronological proximity. Of course, both buildings are clearly within a modern tradition. They're both open college campuses. But the treatment of architectural elements is quite unlike. Consider the detailing of the roof eaves. Here again is the Akademie der Künste. Note the way the edge of the eave is stepped. Each of the 5 or so setbacks trick the eye into seeing the edge as a series of narrow bands, rather than taking in its full thickness all at once. The white paint emphasizes shadow lines and underplays the building's different components by making them all part of the same abstract language. By contrast, the eave at the Hochschule für Verwaltungswissenschaften is flat and unprofiled. It's even thicker than the leading edge of the roof in order to conceal a rain gutter behind it. And you can see 2 projecting scuppers from which that water pours when it rains. A cage of columns attaches to the eave fascia, although certainly the overhang could have supported itself as a cantilever. The effect is to make it seem even weightier. The palette of materials, aluminum fascia cladding, white painted steel columns, black anodized glass facade mullions, fir wood strips under the soffit means that each component demands recognition, entirely unlike the all-white Akademie der Künste. So what changed for Ruf in this short time? It might be a simple change of heart or authorial preference, perhaps a question of prevailing philosophy or client taste. I would argue that in Ruf's case, there is a turning point, a specific moment. In 1954, the American architectural firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, a pioneer in industrial glass facade construction, was stripped of its commission for the US consulate in Munich. SOM had already completed 4 consulates elsewhere in Germany, but the loss of this commission ended their German work entirely. Within a matter of months, Ruf had secured the commission for himself. The US High Commission in Germany transmitted to him all of SOM's drawings and access to the German contractors who had built their American inflected buildings. This was the turning point in his architectural style. I can tell you this with some certainty only because the documents that made each of these buildings have survived. At some point after Ruf's death in 1982, the contents of his Munich architectural office were transported to the house he had designed for his family on Lake Tegern, some 50 kilometers away. Everything, drawings, binders, notes, fragments, remains intact in the custody of his 2 daughters, Note Burger, an architect who worked for her father, and Elisabeth. In the process of making any building, authorship passes through many hands. It includes the more generic, products specified, details mandated, building codes maintained, as well as the singular, the worker in the field, the worker at a desk, the inhabitant of what results from their labors. Historically, however, architects have preferred to tell a more glorified story about their practice. This story insists on the heroic individual, whether virtuoso designer or unnamed mythic master craftsman. It is an inherently classist story, dismissive of unskilled labor or standardized components. In this version of the story, intention is valued above realization. The stories used to envision a design are the ones that are cared for in libraries, archives, and museums. But the purposeful construction document, the annotated takeoff, the catalog cut sheet, the down and dirty on-site scribble, these exist for the lowly purpose of communication between white-collared and blue-collared. They bridge the gap between what is imagined and what is made. To undervalue them is to misunderstand what is at stake. Construction drawings vanish over time. No one bothers with them once their work is done. Construction drawings are inherently unlike all other architectural drawings. Perspectives, plans, cross sections, and frontal elevations all have reference in a layperson's life. We can recognize the space we inhabit in those kinds of drawings. We've all navigated cities by looking at a map or considered the rooms of a dollhouse whose facade has been locked off. Construction details and drawings are much harder to enter. They negotiate the junctures among different trades. They suggest a finished state while they describe all the steps required to get there. In the absence of special training, they are illegible. Their authority to coordinate labor and assemble materials should command respect anyway. As an architectural historian who practices sometimes as an architect, I project my own experience with construction drawings onto those by the architects I study. This act of speculative empathy allows me to see through each drawings. I can read the degree of trust transferred to the workers on site, the affection for specific materials or products, the dedication to ensuring precise execution of what's on the paper. My education in construction drawing began in the mid-90s. Renzo Piton, a gifted Northern Italian architect who grew up in a family of furniture makers, taught me the foundations of more or less everything I now know. She demanded that I draw at life size. My misconceptions and mistakes appeared on paper where she could correct them, rather than on site where it was often too late. Her principles were logical and not at all academic. Draw from the bottom up, she said, to mimic the way gravity will act. Draw elements in the order of their assembly. Imagine what would be put in place first, what happens thereafter, just as a laborer builds. Know where components are fastened to one another, but also know the direction from which a screw or nail is driven. If there's no place in the drawing for a hammer to swing or a screwdriver to twist, then no one will be able to build what you draw on site either. What her training left me with was the capacity to see a kind of time machine in every construction drawing, one that tracks from a desired outcome to its genesis in material and know-how. Job books, the binders that hold all paperwork accruing to an ongoing project, are even less likely than construction drawings to survive. Unlike the construction drawing, the documents and job books are rarely part of productive negotiations. Quite the contrary. They're a hedge against unforeseen costs, errors in execution, and denials of responsibility. They anticipate the job site's ugliest moments, born of the rule that dictates never to admit error or ignorance. They support the architect in all the frustratingly difficult attempts to adjudicate disputes between laborers who are loath, like, you're gonna pay me to do his work for him, to negotiate the gaps in precision that separate their trades. Job books also address the distrust between labor and capital, the two fronts whose wrath converges on the architect. They're a heavy and unrewarding burden on a discipline that would prefer to imagine itself as simply good. There's no obvious place for job books in the acquisition practices standard to museums and libraries. An intact job binder might, in the best case, be called during accession for items that, for example, were signed by someone deemed important. More likely, its content becomes landfill. Few institutions are equipped to preserve all of it wholesale. But if it survives, its aspect changes as time passes. It comes to represent the concerns of an era, the state of technology, what was valued by the person who'd collected its content. Perhaps even more so than the construction drawing, which often bears the initials of its drafter. These documents are a monument to the anonymous history from which architecture always emerges. Here, for example, you see on the left, Wolf's office negotiating with the manufacturer of standard door jambs to revise a detail. On the right, someone has corrected with a sharp pencil the invoice of a painting company that appears to have overcharged. Neither of these documents could have been amended this way without total knowledge, born of constant vigilance on the construction site. This speaks volumes about the tight control Wolf's office maintained and the influence it held over those who delivered its projects. All of which makes the whole family archive that much more spectacular. I will admit here to being a totemist of sorts, believing that artifacts become touchstones of past moments. Some totems work by convention, the wedding ring, the bronze baby shoe, the tattoo. But to me, the much more attractive proposition is that totemic meaning emerges of its own accord. Because this emergence offers no dictates to guide the collector, it's the more difficult to nurture. To summarize, this kind of collecting might be difficult to distinguish from an impulse merely to hold on to everything. This accounts only in part for the awe I feel at seeing precisely lettered vellums from the 1940s spread out on the Wolf's dining table. Part of that awe is also a recompense for my own shortcomings. Sadly, I am a poor archivist. Things that move into my orbit suffer attrition. The US Postal Service sack that never arrived, filled with beloved but uninventoried books and LPs, mailed back from birth. And more tragically, the letter written by my 27-year-old father to his younger sister, which my cousin entrusted to me at my father's funeral, but which disappeared during a purge meant to target old bank statements and pay stubs. It only re-emerged many years later, and only by chance. My first visit to the two Wolfdamen lasted a summer afternoon. Steady rain slipped through weak spots in the roof and fell into pails that Elizabeth had placed with absolute precision around the living room. For hours, I leafed through complete sets of project documents, invoices, sketches and margins, telephone notes, completed working drawings, everything that comprises the life of an architectural project. The Wolves sat with me, chatting with each other, interrupting work only once, mid-afternoon, for strong coffee. On subsequent visits, they remained unfailingly generous with their remarkable collection, while the house around them became increasingly porous to climate. Even Elizabeth's trips up to the roof to brush tar-based mastic over emergent leaks could not entirely offset genteel impecunity. Thick rolls of original drawings for all Wolf's projects rest in stacks. Leitz brand ring binders, the hallmark of German bureaucratic efficiency, are exactly as the Wolf office left them. Meanwhile, the house in which they are kept struggles to persist against the elements. But with equal rigor, Elisabeth Wolf preserves century-old glass Christmas tree ornaments and effortlessly locates any document I've ever requested. So even if all that I'm advocating for here is true, I still owe an explanation for what exactly material of this kind can contribute to my narrative about the changes in modernist architecture at this time. Here is a very specific example. These are two construction drawings, the lower from the Akademie der Künste and the upper from the Hochschule für Verwaltungswissenschaften. Both were drawn at full scale, attesting to the degree to which Wolf's office maintained its role in determining every aspect of the projects, leaving nothing to the window or facade fabricators. In the bottom drawing, Each component piece of steel is drawn precisely. At that relatively early moment after the war, it would have been more common for steel companies to roll standard sections that could be used in different configurations to make up a window. What you see here is Wolf's office deliberately specifying each of those standard sections to make a custom window frame. Much effort has gone into detailing the frames to be as thin as possible. The trick is to use the horizontal depth of the window. So if you can see my cursor, this dimension, rather than the frame thickness, which would be the dimension perpendicular to it, to provide the strength needed to hold the heavy double glazing. What shocks me as a practicing architect is the fact that this drawing offers no allowance for a ceiling that is not perfectly plumb and flat, or an anchor bolt that has not been perfectly inserted into the concrete sill. And here you see the drafted line of a perfectly flat ceiling with a steel rolled section snug up against it as if they had been made in a cabinetry workshop. Clearly, this degree of perfection on site is a near impossibility, but by drawing this way and maintaining control on site tight enough, for example, to correct the painter's invoice, Wolf's office left nothing to chance. The upper drawing details fixed glazing in a wall made up of square-edged extruded aluminum sections. The sensibility shown in the steel windows is turned on its head. It's the wide edge of the aluminum that faces the line of sight. So that's this dimension here. The already thick sections are doubled up, although it's hard to imagine that this would have been a structural necessity. And the juncture between them is covered by an additional flat bar. This has the effect on the eye of emphasizing the composite dimension rather than allowing it to be broken down into two more slender pieces. The facade's lack of relief, its heaviness, the use of aluminum extrusions reference a very different architectural paradigm and completely different industrial production processes than the window details at the bottom. For me, these details confirm unequivocally that Wolf, over the course of the few years at stake, learned to exploit the expansion of possibilities offered by the transforming West German facade construction industry. He took on an entirely different palette as he integrated new techniques and developments he might initially have encountered firsthand through his participation in the American consular projects. Schwippert, by comparison, never embraced that paradigm, and he never lost his taste for the architecture of material simplicity he advocated for early in the decade. The documents of his work that have survived are different in nature than those of Wolf's, but they attest to this. Most of Schwippert's papers are held in institutional archives. His design and presentation drawings are preserved at the Architecture Museum of the Technical University of Munich, and his ephemera, so to speak, is in the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg, although the holdings there were still largely uncatalogued at the time I began my research, more than 35 years after his death. But his office's documents of work, they're gone. Schwippert was an inveterate iterator. In the absence of his construction documents, I instead will refer to as marginalia. They're quick, stunningly accurate, expressive pencil sketches like these two tiny thumbnails you see here. I'll also refer to the detritus of his countless partially completed publication projects. These are galleys, contact sheets, and pasted up manuscripts. When I finally fortuitously did find 2 job books from his renovation of the Hedwigskathedrale, St. Hedwig's Cathedral in former East Berlin, I found that his affinity for the precise but unpedantic, for the endlessly iterated as apparent in his sketches, indeed carried over to the way he made his architecture. Consider the way he dealt with the major commission of his career, the Bundeshaus Parliament in Bonn, completed in a breathtaking 11 months from design to occupancy in 1949. Over the course of a single week, Schwippert produced numerous sketches for the complex, of which these are only 3. These drawings beautifully render volume and landscape, but are also careful to depict glazing precisely as dark gridded surfaces. Glass was essential to Schwippert's ambition to make this, quote, the lightest parliament in the world. While much has been written about the obvious, transparent glass to represent transparent democracy, few have noted how difficult it would have been to acquire the materials for a glass building in 1949. Fewer still have acknowledged that actually very little of the project was made in glass. But this making do in spite of is at the heart, for me, of Schwippert's achievements. The drawing on the left marks Schwippert's first use of a surface grid to articulate facades even where there's no glass. The grid unifies the rangy complex, but it also implies that the building is wrapped in a skeleton, much as a curtain wall or glass building would have been. It implies transparency where, in fact, there is none. These galleys from an unrealized monograph show the complex's administrative wings. Conventional windows are set within a grid of darker stone. The low relief has the effect of conjoining them to a single field, conjoining in a single field the inset windows with the spandrels below them. As the photograph on the left makes plain, one might easily mistake this for a typical glazed office building facade. Schwippert was a master of using the ad hoc, whether to create the illusion of transparency on a surface or to solve the structure of the long span plenary at a moment when West German steel was limited, subject to requisition by the US. This photograph, shot by the rare woman photographer, Irma Wagner-Hemke, offers evidence of how he managed. In the photo, two men stand at the top of a laddered steel column. The steel truss, their positioning, one that will span the 30-meter wide plenary hall, is as high as they are tall. There's no doubt the two men, secure in their precarious stances, have done work like this before. Both look towards the come-along at the truss's center span as their hands guide the suspended truss into position. Both column and truss type are typical of bridge building, which was the primary business of the company that these men worked for. The trusses, the columns, and the labor to install them were appropriated directly from infrastructure. To appreciate the immensity of the undertaking that the Bundeshaus represented, the speed of its realization, the modulation of its limited material palette, and the sophistication of the finished building demands acceptance of the fact that its construction was jury-rigged. The sleight of hand that Schwippert employed in his facade grid emerges in all his details if one looks carefully. The plenary wall shown here in close-up from his galleys is a perfect example. On the exterior, the windows lay flat within a steel grid. On the interior, they're angled with one edge coplanar to the innermost point of the steel flange and the other coplanar with the exterior glazing. In actuality, the steel grid in which the windows sit is part of the building's bearing structure, not its enclosure. Each primary vertical mullion supports the roof, and each intermediary horizontal, equally deep, resists the force of the wind off the Rhine. The window frame, the window structure, and the bearing structure are conflated so that these large glazed areas appear instead as a single delicate glass surface. Schwippert never abandoned his readiness to engage the jury-rig, but more importantly, his details show an architect willing to leave discretion to the people who executed his instructions. This is a detail preserved in one of the two binders to which I was given access at St. Hedwig's Cathedral, recently discovered in 2014, before a renovation that has since sadly erased most of Schwippert's work. The binders are quintessential job books for an inconceivably complicated project conducted over 7 years, during which Schwippert from Dusseldorf ran the renovation in East Berlin across a Cold War fractured country. The detail is specific, drawn with total accuracy at full scale, but it was left only minimally dimensioned and annotated, allowing the fabricator to specify hinge, angle, attachment method, and a host of other things that in the materially poor East German building economy could not have been foreseen from Schwippert's office. By comparison to Wolff's millimeter precision and relentless stipulation of components, Schwippert's drawing is a mere suggestion of potential outcomes, one of many possible iterations. Schwippert's countless photographs of the building in various partial states of completion speak to his temperament as an architect, a sort of Saul LeWitt avant la lettre, sending his instructions across the wall, receiving photographs that may or may not have depicted conditions on the ground, accepting ad hocism on an enormous scale. The spareness and simplicity of his detailing and materials were perhaps of necessity, but they also hold true to the architectural style, the atmosphere, the material culture he'd supported since the war's end. I'll return briefly again to Ruf for comparison. As Schwippert embraced the aleatory in his Hedwigskathedrale, Ruf precisely stipulated its semblance. These are drawings for a stone fountain in the courtyard of the Hochschule für Verwaltungswissenschaften. Clearly, the stone was meant to appear naturalistic and rough, a counterpoint to the precision of its architectural settings, but nevertheless, it was drawn in dimension down to the millimeter, although to quite spectacularly beautiful results, which may remind some of you, not coincidentally, of Noguchi's work with Gordon Bunshaft for SOM at the Lever House or Connecticut General Life. It's important to note, though, that neither of those projects were published in Germany until after Ruf's design development phase. Even amidst their divergences in style, Ruf and Schwippert remained, I would argue, in agreement about the agenda formulated at the 1951 Darmstädter Gespräch about architecture's contribution to the cultural ethics of West German society. Unbureaucratic was Schwippert's shorthand applied even to his government building, populated by career politicians and, yes, bureaucrats. Joy in the world of the little man was another way in which the idea was formulated. It animated Eiermann and Ruf's architecture and Schwippert's curation for the West German Pavilion at the 1958 World's Fair. The importance of the everyday, the light, the playful, to both the private and public realms in which the modest citizen spent his or her days was their central concern. Consider what might seem an insignificant element of the pavilion, the inclusion of a collapsible boat moored and inviting at an artificial lake. It was already represented in an early 1956 site model where the boat appeared in miniature. Its connotation, as with every other product selected for the pavilion, included but went beyond its aesthetics. It signaled access to leisure, equipped with nifty accoutrements, but it was also associated with adventure and a return to the world. 2 years earlier, a German physician had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a boat of similar model, garnering him coverage in Life magazine. This was a distinction which only he and West German Chancellor Adenauer had until then enjoyed. Produced by a firm which employed an impressive 1,500 workers, the boat also signaled that Germany's consumer products industry was poised to restore the country to international presence by means of its civil society. The world of the little man was also an export product. Precisely this concern for representation and affirmation of the new West German civil society, asserted in the many, many drafts Schwippert wrote for a text published in various versions after the opening of the pavilion, was summarized in a quotation he chose from a long since vanished Le Figaro report from the World's Fair, quote, "The Germans have, with a delicacy of sensibility and with grace, built a pavilion of exemplary sobriety in which the clear and strong symbol has replaced the aggregated and the quantified. What modest synthesis. And what a surprise for everyone who believed they knew Germany from hearsay. They have returned to the peaceful garden of Europe's wise children." That return was perhaps an atmospheric shift, a change in sensibility held, at least for that moment, in the spaces that both Schwippert and Ruf had made there. Thank you. And glad to take questions.
Thank you very much, Lynnette, for really this incredible presentation. I'll be moderating the question period, and I'll start it off, in fact, with a few questions of my own. If you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways we can proceed. You can either use the raise hand function on Zoom, and we'll get to you hopefully in the order of the raised hands, or you can also add your comment or question directly into the chat, and I'll read that question for all of us. To begin, maybe we can close the share screen, or so. You know, the topic you discussed today is not something that I know all that much about. So I'm going to try to tackle the kind of larger context in my first question. And it's really about the kind of European, maybe even American response to the war. So the immediate post-war period. What really struck me, especially with Ruf's work, is just how restrained an architectural response it is to the kind of cataclysmic war, which had really engulfed Germany, and this especially, you know, given his participation in things like the Darmstädter Gespräch, which seemed to, you know, I mean, one of the invitees was Heidegger, seemed to kind of drill down into the kind of existential question of homelessness. So wars, of course, had tremendous effects on architecture and urban planning, and immediate post-war periods have been some of the most creatively fertile moments in architectural history. So we can think, of course, of, say, the founding of the Bauhaus in Weimar soon after the First World War. The Second World War was no exception. Even before the dust has settled, architects were already reassessing pre-war priorities, which retrospectively they deemed too limited, rationalizing, and maybe even alienating. So one noteworthy attempt to recalibrate architectural ambitions came in 1943 at the hands of the Swiss art historian Siegfried Giedion, Catalan architect Louis Sert, and French painter Fernand Léger. They titled it 9 Points on Monumentality, and called for civic centers to be renewed with new expressions of, quote, social, ceremonial, and community life that exceeded functional fulfillment. They envisioned civic spaces really revitalized by the fusion of art forms. And you can see, you know, these kind of three disciplines being represented here: architecture, painting, and history. So they called for mural painting, public sculptures, monumental architecture that answered what they described as the eternal need of a people to create symbols. You see the same rhetoric emerging around the need for a, quote, human-centered approaches to building. You see that in Le Corbusier's adoption of a system of measurement based on human proportions. He adopts this in the mid-40s and calls it the modular. You see it in the art historian Rudolf Wittgauer's groundbreaking study of the Italian Renaissance, which really centered the question of humanism. It's called Architecture Principles in the Age of Humanism, published in 1949. And of course, in the post-war meetings of CIAM, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, which was a kind of Congress which brought together really both major and many minor modernist architects the world over. And the post-war, as you know, the post-war Congresses really are replete with the kind of some of the same rhetoric, with presentations, for example, by Walter Gropius on the question of the human scale, discussions considering how Italian piazzas can generate new models for urban form, etc. So in other words, there's a kind of retour à l'ordre in the post-war, where the human-centered architecture is being deeply considered. And as I said, given the Darmstädter Gespräch meetings that you described a little bit at the beginning of your talk, I wondered to what extent Ruf, I mean, Schwippert's work is a little bit more in the kind of embrace of ad hoc and And you can see it in the work, but to what extent did these ideas permeate themselves into the works produced by these two German architects?
So it's important to remember that despite efforts, and this was mostly on behalf of Richard Döcker, who was an architect who had remained in Germany during the war and was close to Gropius, and here I'm drawing on the work of Werner Duth, who did his utmost to get Gropius to advocate for a German delegation to Siam. There was no German delegation to Siam. They were not invited, right? And of course, everyone followed Siam, but I think that that exclusion changed the landscape somewhat. I think the other thing that's important to think about, and I'm right now reading a new book by Paul Betts, the historian who's written quite a bit about industrial design history, both in West and East Germany. He makes what I think is a really wonderful and salient point about the reconstruction process after the war, that much of it was deeply rooted in Christian belief systems, specifically Christian. They began to call it Judeo-Christian at a certain point. There were many different camps and schools in West Germany after the war. There were those who had been affiliated with Speer and his regime, many of whom were denazified and put back into power as urban planners and city architects as expedients. And they were, let's say, at least in what I know about them, and they've been very well documented as well by Duth and by others, by Guccio. They were, let's say, more pragmatic, right? They were less interested in engaging questions of style and architecture as a kind of value system. The architects who I've spent more time studying, and I would say, it's important to note, Ruf did not write very much about architecture. His presence at Darmstadt in 1951 is one of the few moments, at least from what I've found, and if I've recognized correctly, the expert on Ruf happens to be at this meeting, so I'm happy to have myself corrected. That is one of the few moments where he actually talks about his beliefs in architecture. Schwippert was an intellectual. Schwippert was an affiliate of a sort of a Catholic circle around Guardini, who was also, who Mies was very involved in, and was heavily influenced by Rudolf Schwarz. And there is, I think, a fascinating lineage from the late 40s until the mid 50s around the Deutsche Werkbund. So you have Otto Bartning, who is Protestant, and you have Rudolf Schwarz and some of the others who are Catholic. And they're really trying to rethink architecture through the lens of a kind of very particular theology. Schwarz had worked extensively with Albert Renkerpatsch before the war, trying to speculate on a way of thinking of mechanization, industrialization, photography, etc., in opposition to what the Bauhaus was doing. And with the, let's say, evacuation or Americanization of the Bauhaus in the post-war period, in a sense, you have the field open to practitioners and thinkers who had been the kind of underdogs of history writ large around modern architecture, of which Gideon, of course, was the prime protagonist. So I would say your depiction of the post-war scene is certainly broader and more clear than what I could offer of that larger scene. I think there's still work to be done on a very different kind of atmosphere, at least early on in Germany. And I would say there is a breaking point in it that comes around 1953, 1954. There's what's called the Bauhaus debate, when Schwarz and Gropius or Gropius's proxies get into a sort of battle royale around a magazine. And It's also at the moment where you begin to see changes in industrial production, changes in construction practice, changes in ambition. But there is that moment where there's something fragile and very specific, but is highly theologically flavored in Germany.
One of the things that struck me while reading the notes to your talk, because of course you shared them with me a few days ago, and of course hearing it today spoken, is just how far in a way your approach deviates from the way that I think many architectural historians speak about their work and speak about their buildings. And I don't think it's merely a consequence of your vantage point as a practicing architect, although I think that really brilliantly shines through in this talk. After all, most, although not all, architectural historians have some architectural training and experience. I also don't think it's simply about your willingness to bring an autobiographical element to your work, to walk us through the process of discovery, however revealing are these glimpses into the long history of the artifacts you work with and the intimate accounts of Ruf's caretakers. What struck me rather is your ability to see through the dialogue, internal and out of construction, to place value in the process of design. Your approach here, I think, shows architecture to be less a product of the mind than a process of negotiation, of communication, and miscommunications, of chance opportunities, Schwippert's love, for example, for the ad hoc. So in a way, this talk was, in fact, as much about the architects, Ruf and Schwippert, as it was about the very objects and mechanisms by which architectural products are conceived, developed, and executed. So as such, your approach aims to displace, I think, and this is in fact the question, to see the kind of stakes of your approach, displace and maybe even challenge some of the key assumptions in the broader story, or we could call it the meta story of the architect's rise into his or her preeminent command over building and the building trades. That rise has been seen to begin historically in the Italian Renaissance, the eclipse of the medieval master mason, the promotion of architecture from a mechanical art to a pursuit worthy of humanistic study. And eventually, that kind of meta story is seen as culminating in the figure of the modernist architect. So alongside the rise of the architect, historians have also noted that drawing too became increasingly instrumental in the building process, starting in the Quattrocento. By the 18th century, drawings really had become the kind of principal form of communication between the architect on the one side and the public and clients and building trades on the other. Indeed, drawing introduced something of a schism in the discipline, leading eventually to the undervaluing of those who carried out the labor of building. This particular dynamic was neatly summed up by the Austrian architect or polemicist Adolf Loos when he wrote, "The architect has ousted the craftsman. He has learned draftsmanship." So, but these accounts of the history of the profession have tended to leave out all that is not captured in the architect's recorded instructions, not identified in drawings or sketches. And so in your talk, we see, I think, the crucial missing part of this story. Drawings are read as really relational devices. One can infer from them much more than those things that they were originally intended to convey. They are, I think, as you call them, monuments to an anonymous history. And artifacts, and your purpose here seems to be to listen hard, to be attentive to the moment drawings and artifacts reveal the world within which they were created, the hierarchies, the class distinctions, the levels of trust, the know-how, the subtle perceptual moments intended, though perhaps not fully captured by completed buildings. So I guess I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on your methods, I think there's almost a kind of ethics of looking here, and speak a little bit more about the question of the documents that you use and why you, in a way, put, I think, more weight on the kind of minor artifacts in some cases than on the kind of major blueprints and major drawings that make up the profession.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's that dumb, well, it's not so dumb. There's the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean, we all want to make a specific contribution, and I would say that there are other architectural historians who have done brilliant work on the figures that I'm interested in, the period in which I work. So I don't know that I would say it's a displacement of their methods, and maybe it's an augmentation. I like very much this idea of listening carefully. And I think in part that comes from, you know, from affinities I have for other people's way of looking. I was fortunate to study with Joseph Connors when I was in graduate school, and his work on Borromini is incredibly attentive to what kind of snail shells were found in his collection upon his death, right? Or where an engraving plate has been scratched and reprinted to make a change. So where the pinpoints of a compass can be seen on a drawing. So there's a kind of, you know, intense detective work. Another book that I really admire as a kind of precedent is Christian Zumi's work on the Maison Glatte in Geneva, which is really an architect with the utmost care, sifting through each decision made and all of their implications. The book Strange Details by Mike Codwell is another example where it's the most beautiful description of the Farnsworth house, seen from the perspective of the many steps that the welder need to go through, both adding and subtracting steel in order to get the building to levitate. So if there is a displacement that I would wish for, it's the displacement of the detail as a kind of fetishistic moment in a building, right? As if it's, you know, a singular completed object at which, as if it's a moment of rhetoric or a rhetorical figure. When people speak about Nice's details, oh, look at Nice's corners, very often it's all about how this resolution of a corner relates to a long history of trying to resolve the corner, right? It's less about what needed to happen in order for that detail to have been put together the way it was. What were the compromises? What was being thought, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's a political moment in all of this, and maybe it's a class moment, having practiced architecture in New York for 15 years or so, and having done work that mostly amounted to real estate enhancement for wealthy people, the people I valued most were the people who did the work, the people on site. They drove me crazy. But if there is displacement, on the one hand, maybe it's a sort of fetishistic idea of the detail, which is what you see in many architecture schools, or when people say, oh, look at the details, that's what they're thinking of. You're not reading into them. And on the other hand is the sort of question of class. So I don't know that that satisfies your question, but.
Oh, absolutely. So we've got a question in the chat, so I'll read it. It's from Satyajit Bose, and they write, I find it intriguing that your work in sustainability management, which is concerned with valorizing the minimal use and prudent stewardship of materials. To what extent do you think it is essential to have experienced material poverty, displacement, and occupation to develop the respect for ephemera that seems to be a hallmark of the conscientious archivist? Is it scarcity of the material, or scarcity of the attention that generates value for particular ephemera?
That is a wonderfully phrased question. I've already let slip that I personally, I'm a poor archivist. There is I think perhaps one of my real fascinations with this period is the sort of enduring legacy of scarcity, right? the fact of, and again, and looking at this period in particular, that seemed to me a fact that had gone unspoken and unnoticed. What are the consequences of that scarcity? What does it mean? And there are wonderful passages in the Darmstädter Gespräch of 1951 where these architects are really arguing with each other about whether or not they should envision a modern architecture built out of old-fashioned material, right? Can you make something transparent when it's made out of stucco and brick? And their answer is yes, absolutely. And maybe that's a self-serving answer for people who at that point don't have adequate material, but it's also a direct affront to the sort of the major history of modern architecture, which is always proclaiming itself at the avant-garde of material usage, right? We need to reflect the spirit of our time, the materials of our time. And what is so fascinating about this moment too is its investment in material of all kind, driven by scarcity. I mean, I would have to put the question to the two Wolf Damen, why they're such careful stewards of the material that they hold. I think in their case, it may be as simple as just love, right? Love and respect and affection. And I hope I did justice to that in talking about the way they hold it. So I hope I can someday write an essay about the question that Sajid asked, but I appreciate it.
Are there any more questions? We're going to wrap up in a bit, but if there are any questions, please, again, raise your hand or enter your question into the chat function. I guess while we wait, maybe you can speak a little bit about using the term ephemera. I know that over, say, artifacts or minor artifacts, are you pointing to a kind of type of scholarship that's been emerging where ephemera is playing a big part in?
Sure, of course. I mean, you know, I come out of the generation that sort of believed they invented or discovered the idea of material culture, right, as part of historical study. And you know, all of it in a weird way goes back to Alois Riegel at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, writing about the Roman art industry, writing about the idea of the unintentional monument. There's something, and I guess in my own personal case, having filled too many job books with the wrong documents so that when I needed one, what I actually wanted wasn't there. Yeah, there's also a kind of you know, it's as Riegel wrote, it's history writ small. It's not always the history of the great advances or the large events or the history written by the victors, right? So I think my affection for this more minor material comes from that as well.
We've got a question from Ryan McCaffrey. If you might turn your video and sound on.
Hi, yes, good morning. Hi, good morning, everyone. Hi, Lynnette. Yes, thank you for your talk, Lynnette, and also thank you for introducing all of us to the phrase genteel impecunity, which has been on my mind since you said it. I had a question if you thought that the different attitudes and approaches of these two architects might also be related to the programs of the buildings that they were designing, or even of the types of clients that they were working with. And if those clients might have some other ideas of their own about control or resolution for the architectural expression of the project that they were paying for. So just trying to go from the ephemera back out to those bigger questions I think you were mentioning about Catholic versus Protestant ideas, and just maybe some of those bigger ideas in society about how that architectural expression might have played out. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they had very, very different careers, for sure. You know, there's I'm certainly making myself vulnerable to critique by trying to compare two architects who are so radically dissimilar in so many ways. You know, Schwippert was a really important figure of the post-war period. He was a kind of, you know, I don't know what the right word is. He was a politically incredibly well connected. He had the ear of the both of industry and of the West German government in advocating for design as both an economic driver and as a kind of export project. Like, you can think of the Super Dutch of the 1990s and what Holland did to promote its architecture and its architects. And it was almost on that level. You know, he was in constant correspondence with the head of Braun. You know, he was a powerful guy. And maybe his trade-off was to practice a little less. I mean, you know, in terms of what his connections were, he probably could have had a larger practice if he had chosen to. I am not the Schwippert expert per se. I guess I'm the Schwippert expert in the room. But he did quite large projects. So he did, you know, the parliament building that was occupied by West Germany for almost all of the time of that country's existence. His building was only taken down, I believe it was in the late 80s, right before reunification. It's kind of, you know, tragedy of history that the building was destroyed and then the government left Bonn. He did work for, I believe it was large radio station or TV station. I wish I had my Schwippert monograph in front of me right now. The Hedwigskathedrale is a fascinating story because it's so aligned to his interest in and role as the kind of go-between, the guy who knows everyone. And he got it really through his connections, both as a professor in Düsseldorf, but also through his connections as part of the kind of Catholic cohort of architects. And so much of that project was just about negotiation. But I would say some of that were his choices. If you look at the other projects that I haven't shown, you see him experimenting with a much richer palette of materials, with much more, let's say, you know, less modest means, but always with a kind of back and forth with the people who are making the project at a very bespoke scale. With Ruf, and you know, this is something that I would love to discuss with others who have thought about his career more expansively than I have. You know, it's hard not to see a change of heart. It's hard not to see a kind of radical about face in his aesthetics or his interests. I think it would do him a disservice to see it as acquiescence either to clients or to prevailing trends or to, you know, I mean, there's a reason that the post-war period is called the high modernist period, and a reason that its idiom is so closely linked to the United States as a victor nation. Germany is not the only place where this happened. And one might argue that it hasn't stopped happening for better or worse, right? Not everything we export is particularly good or desirable. But I think what was particular about Ruf's case, and this is what I was trying to argue, is that, I mean, he was as brilliantly diplomatic and as well connected and as eloquent with his clients as Schwippert was, and made, I think, few compromises, although he had many headaches. He was also, there was a period in his life where he was dealing in construction materials. He collaborated to get larger projects from the outset. So he was looking for a very different kind of practice. And what I can't prove, but what I anticipate is that via his connection with SOM and the contractors in West Germany who were doing those buildings, he had an early link to a kind of avant-garde of this particular kind of architecture, right? It wasn't like others who around that time were reading it in magazines. He knew the people who could do this. So it positioned him differently. And I think those opportunities expressed in a willingness to try out this other idiom, and it's an idiom that I think that he mastered. But again, what I'm trying to do is avoid saying that it was, you know, either contingency or imposed or calculated in some way that was anything other than like genuine.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for that question. If there are no more questions, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who will conclude the event. Thank you to the audience, and thank you so much, Lynnette, for really this really inspiring talk.
Lynnette, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I was thinking, apropos of the ephemera, of the difference in the, there was not only a difference in style and manner of practice between these two architects, but in one case, there was a home to go to with two daughters living in it, with water coming in through the roof, but that nevertheless had preserved the whole complex set of workbooks that were your holy grail. And the other case of Schwippert, who sounded, if I got it right, to have been the more successful in some ways, or at least the well-known public big project guy. None of this was available to you. The archival traces for Schwippert, despite his extraordinary success, appear to, if not vanish, to have been inaccessible. And it was these two sisters in the family home who had serendipitously preserved everything for you. So I was thinking a little bit about that ephemeral side of the trace and the trace that attracted your attention to come back to Anouk's original observation. That was the trace, I think, that seemed to have attracted your attention. But it was beautiful talk. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ralph, very, very much for doing such a lovely job of discussing it. I just really, all I want to say is do join us, everybody, in 2 weeks' time when we're going to hear from the composer, Skye McClay, who's a fellow at the Institute. And please join me now in thanking Lynnette warmly for a most wonderful start to our series. Lynnette, thank you very, very much for getting us off to such a wonderful start. Thank you.
Thank you so much.